Hello and welcome to episode 7, part 1 of Conversations with History. In this episode, we're going to cover the first 2.5 years of the Civil War. We're going to look at the election of 1860, the secession crisis, and then the beginning of the conflict. I'm once again joined by my colleague, Mr. Jeff Robinson.
Good morning, Tyler. How you doing?
Pretty good, pretty good. It's a little early. It's not yet 9 o'clock. Is that early?
For some people, yes.
So our last episode 6, part 1 and 2, is probably my favorite part of American history. It's something I gravitated to in my studies. That's slavery, the nature of slavery, and the sectional crisis. Kind of, what brings us to the Civil War. I know for you, the Civil War is, without doubt, your favorite part of American history.
Yes, I was actually thinking on the way down here. It's just it's a true watershed moment for American history. This war is it's just fascinating. You think about it, it's fought by the grandsons of revolutionary veterans and the grandfathers of World War veterans. It will be called the last of the old wars. When they first start this war, they're in the 18th century, back in the 18th century, using Napoleonic warfare. When they end this war, they're in trenches, and they're using tactics we won't see again until the First World War. So it's a link of our past and our future, and it's a watershed moment for our country's history, and it's just fascinating to me.
Right. So we did 2 whole episodes. We did 1 episode on the Slave South, and then we did a whole episode on the sectional crisis. So all the listeners should really understand, with westward expansion, the Mexican cession, the crisis there, the expansion of slavery, that question, the idea of the gag rule in Congress that you're not allowed to talk about slavery, and then we get this kind of peaceful political era between 1820 and 1850, between the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850. But then after 1850, the entirety of the decade of the 1850s is just marred by sectional conflict until it becomes untenable. And the moment where it really boils over, the last thing we talked about was John Brown's raid, and how this moment kind of tells the Southern people that Northerners and abolitionists are going to be willing to fight and kill Southerners to free slaves. That's when they say, well, if one of these Republicans gets elected, we'll have to leave the Union, right? And one point that we did make was, as we move into talking about the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was would have been considered one of the more conservative members of the Republican Party. There were definitely a lot more radical members of the party.
Yeah, and in fact, that's one of the reasons he got the nomination, because they tried in 1856 with John C. Fremont. The first time the Republican Party put up a guy, and he was just too radical in his views, and they realized that. And there were others in 1860 much more qualified. And it was really just a tremendous upset for Lincoln to come out of that convention with the nomination.
Right, and he's going to end up running in the election of 1860 against Stephen Douglas, who has defeated him for the Senate seat in Illinois in 1858. Of course, there was not a Democratic election. He was selected by the Illinois State House. But with the Lincoln-Douglas debates, it seems to most people that Lincoln won the debates and lost the election. Would you say that's true?
Yes, I've heard those the Lincoln-Douglas debates called one of the top 10 events in American history, non-war related, which kind of gives you an idea of the importance of those debates.
Right. So going into the election of 1860, we see a break in the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party, since Jackson and Van Buren kind of come together to found it, Van Buren, of course, a New Yorker, and Jackson, a Tennessean, a Southerner. And since the beginning of the party, it had been it had not been a sectional party. There were no sectional parties in the United States until the 1850s. The Whig Party, which was the party that Abraham Lincoln came out of, and the party that most of the Republicans will come out of, was also not a sectional party. it was a party of kind of a coalition between Southern aristocrats and Northern industrialists. Well, in 1860, we see these parties kind of coalesce around new ideas, and we get a Southern Democratic Party and a Northern Democratic Party, or at least we get a Northern and a Southern candidate for president.
Absolutely. Interesting to note, John C. Breckinridge, who was the youngest vice president in American history, was 40 years old as vice president. He will be running for president as a Southern Democrat, and several years later, he will find himself defending the salt works in Saltville, Virginia. So,
right, he ends up being a general in the Confederate Army.
Correct.
John Bell, the Constitutional Union Party, is kind of the third party candidate, and he is kind of trying to draw on this cross-sectional coalition of people who are not necessarily they're not Whigs. They're not. They're people who can't agree with either party. That they don't really want the expansion of slavery, but they definitely don't want to dissolve the Union, trying to fight over the expansion of slavery.
Yeah, John Bell is your typical third-party candidate. He's a vote stealer, and he's going to steal quite a bit. He's going to get some of the larger states in the Union. They're right in the center, including Virginia.
Yeah, it's Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky. He takes,
so, yeah.
Correct. And then Stephen Douglas only gets 12 electoral votes. Stephen Douglas probably in 1858, if you ask people, he would probably have been the front runner for the presidency in 1860. By 1860, he just doesn't have the political power that he did 5 years earlier, or even 2 years earlier. And I think we talked about this yesterday. I mentioned it when we were discussing the episode. A lot of people will say, well, if Breckinridge and John Bell hadn't run, Douglas would have won because all of those votes would have gone to Douglas. But if you look at the electoral count, he still wouldn't have won. And why is this an even bigger victory than it looks like for Lincoln on the ballot? He wins all these northern states, right? How did he not get any votes in the southern states? If you look at the rolls, it says Alabama, 0, Georgia, 0, South Carolina, 0.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize this. Lincoln, states were in charge of, like they still are today, of their voting process. And southern states refused to put Lincoln's name on the ballot. So he wasn't even an option to vote for in the South.
Right. And so it's actually probably true that a lot of people voted for Breckinridge or voted for John Bell who would have voted for Lincoln.
That is possible, yes.
That doesn't mean that he was going to take any of those states. I don't believe he was going to win a single southern state. But the fact that he gets 1.9 million popular votes while not being on the ballot in half the country shows you just how powerful the Republican sentiment was in the northern states. So after the election in November, South Carolina has a convention on secession, and they decide to secede on December 20th, 1860.
Yeah, that's about a week after the official electoral votes were tallied. And South Carolina will become the first seceded southern state. They'll actually form their own country, the Republic of South Carolina.
Right, for a very short period.
Yes.
And of course, we have to remember that in this time, this is before the constitutional amendment that changed the inauguration date of the president from March to January.
Yes.
So at this time, the lame duck period of the president is all the way from November, or really December when the votes are counted, all the way until March. So Lincoln has this 4-month period where he's sitting in Illinois. He can't do anything. James Buchanan is lame duck. He has lost the confidence of the nation. He can't do anything or won't do anything. A fun fact, John Floyd is the Secretary of War at this time. And he starts transferring arms from northern armories to southern armories, right? Like he starts taking muskets and cannons and dismantling armaments in forts in southern Indiana and moving them to the south, right? Like this guy knew, most people knew South Carolina was going to secede. And when South Carolina seceded, they were going to take some more states with them. And originally, the 7 Deep South states secede first. And it's not until after the firing on Fort Sumter that the final 4 Confederate states of the total 11 will secede.
Yes, sometimes known as the Cotton States, those deep
Mhm.
southern states there. The upper southern states will secede following Fort Sumter.
Right.
But Virginia was being heavily recruited by the Confederate
Mhm.
states to secede, but they will not do so until after Fort Sumter.
Right. And of course, Jefferson Davis, a Mississippian, will end up being the president of the Confederacy. And one thing that I do want to point out as we move into this, into the Fort Sumter and war segment, is most of these guys who will end up fighting each other had already fought battles, but together, right?
Oh, yes. The Mexican War
Mhm.
is considered a dress rehearsal for the Civil War. U.S. Grant, Robert E. Lee fought side by side,
Mhm.
Along with Stonewall Jackson and George Pickett and various Union generals. They're all going to be there together, fighting for the United States Army.
Right. It is kind of crazy when you look back at it. It's almost every single general. If you just do a quick Wikipedia and look at the conflicts they were that they participated in, you'll see Irvin McDowell, George B. McClellan, almost every officer in the Union and Confederate Army had experience in the Mexican-American War. And when we talked about the Mexican-American War a couple episodes ago, famously Grant in 1885, when he writes his memoir, he says it was the most well-led army that maybe had ever existed.
Mhm.
That the command of Zachary Taylor, Winfield Scott, Robert E. Lee, those junior officers who will become senior officers in the Civil War, that it was unrivaled, the ability to lead. And we'll see that in the Civil War. So the crisis, the secession winter is kind of what it's called, as these states, these seven southern states secede, kind of comes to a head when Lincoln takes office, and there's a fort in Charleston Harbor. And if you've ever been to Charleston, you can go and you can see it from, it's not that far from land. And it was a federal fort. It was not a state-held fort. So there were federal troops in Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Well, Charleston
Flying
Harbor,
the American flag.
right. Charleston Harbor, Charleston is the hotbed of secession.
Mhm.
And when Lincoln takes office, he says he's going to not reinforce Fort Sumter. He's going to bring them provisions. He's going to provision the fort. Well, to the Southerners, that meant reinforce. And so,
yeah, and of course, when Lincoln's sworn in and gives his famous first inaugural, he says there will be no war unless the South starts it, and he meant it. But the thing about Lincoln was, he was going to force the South to fire on them, and he kind of will.
Right, and so on April 12th, 1861, PGT Beauregard, who is, kind of the Southern kind of chivalric symbol of Southern gentlemanhood, begins the Civil War with his firing on Fort Sumter. And it was actually a Virginian who fired the first shot, Edmund Ruffin.
Edmund Ruffin, yes.
Who ended up, he dies in 1865. He commits suicide as the Union troops move through Virginia. But a Virginian did fire the first shot of the war on Fort Sumter. And so at this point, they can't hide it anymore. Like Lincoln can't say, well, there's not going to be a war. We'll work this out. At this point, it's obvious that war is going to happen.
Yeah, diplomatic actions have to cease now.
Right.
And there's going to be a war.
Right. And
which
so,
Lincoln believed was the only really way that they were going to work this out anyway.
And so Virginia and these other, there's this question of border states, right? So Virginia will secede, Tennessee will secede, North Carolina will secede, and Arkansas will secede. Those are the final four states that will create the 11 total Confederate states. But these other states like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, right?
Delaware has slaves.
Right.
Yeah.
And they become what are called border states, where slaves are held, and also where there's considerable Southern sentiment
Mhm.
and Confederate sentiment, but they're not, they don't actually secede.
Yeah, in fact, Missouri and Kentucky, they were about split.
Mhm.
About half the state were pro-Confederate, half pro-Union. And there will be some dramatic moments in this war. One occurring in the first battle at Saltville.
Mhm.
A group from Kentucky, Union troops from Kentucky, will attack Saltville, facing off against pro-Southern Kentucky forces. So it's kind of like a
Right.
civil war within a civil war.
Right. Kind of like what we saw in Kansas with
Yes.
the Kansas, Missouri kind
Yes.
of, and we talked about, how they still used to call the Kansas, Missouri football game the border war.
It is. It's the border war.
And they haven't played it in a while, but that was what they called it.
Mhm.
So we see Lincoln start to scramble for the support of these border states. And I think it might be apocryphal, like he might have not actually said it, but the story goes that he said, I would like to have God on my side, but I need Kentucky. Right.
Exactly.
And
Of course, it's his home. It's his home. Where
Yeah.
he was born.
Mhm. And one thing that people don't realize is that each state had its own specific resources to give, right? And I remember reading in James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, he talks about Missouri and how Missouri was so crucial for both sides because of the mule production, that it was the center for breeding mules.
Wow.
And so both sides wanted, because there were no cars, that they start to use railroads a little bit, but there's not an extensive enough railroad system to supply everywhere you need with railroads. Horses, mules are going to be a huge part of this. And that's part of, like you said, we have the railroad and then we have, horse-drawn carriages. And it's this clash of modern and kind of pre-modern warfare.
Mhm.
So there is a call for immediate action in the North. And Lincoln is of the opinion that immediate action is going to be better than what Winfield Scott will propose, who was the commander of the Union Army at the beginning of the war. He proposes the Anaconda Plan, which was basically a blockade of the South, not allowing any imports or exports into the South, and then an invasion of the South through the Mississippi Delta. And this plan is rejected because they say, well, it'll take too long,
Mhm.
right? So at the first real battle, open battle of the Civil War, large scale, we have the first battle of Bull Run, and we see not Robert E. Lee in command of the Confederate Army. Most people just assume that Robert E. Lee was always in command. Who is in command of the Confederate Army?
Well, the hero of Fort Sumter, Beauregard, and then you have another commander that plays a big role in this, Joseph Johnston,
Mhm.
who grew up in Abingdon.
Right, a native of Abingdon, Virginia, and that's his house on Main Street,
It is.
right? Yeah.
It is.
The house at the four-way intersection in Abingdon is Joseph E. Johnston's home place. And if you look at maps of Confederate and Northern sentiment, like how people voted, Southwest Virginia voted heavily Confederate. And most of them, what is called the White Mountain South, in East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, of course, West Virginia will break away from
Mhm.
Virginia because of so much Union sentiment. Southwest Virginia was a pocket of Confederate sentiment within a kind of an island in a sea of Union sentiment.
Northeast Tennessee.
Right. And so Joseph E. Johnston and PGT Beauregard will meet Irvin McDowell about 30 miles away from Washington, D.C. So this battle happens really close to the Capitol.
Mhm.
And, what transpires there that day?
Well, a couple things we'll point out here. Number one, why are they fighting when they're fighting?
Mhm.
You look at the timing of this. After Fort Sumter, which was April 12th, 1861, Lincoln will call up 75,000 90-day volunteers.
90 days. So
90 days.
They think this war is going to be over pretty fast.
Absolutely.
It might be one battle and, everybody gets tired of it and it's over.
Everyone thought it was going to be one battle. Both
Right.
sides. It wasn't that was not debatable. Both sides thought it'd be quickly over.
Mhm.
The Lincoln believed we'll show them we mean business and they'll come back to the Union.
Mhm.
The South believed we'll show them we mean business and they'll leave us alone. They both believe that.
Mhm.
So Lincoln calls up these 90-day volunteers and he puts them through a crash course of training. Most of these guys have zero military experience,
Mhm.
zero. And he chooses McDowell to lead these men, not because he's the most talented commander,
Right.
it's because his most talented commander he didn't really like,
Mm-hmm.
and he knew that he was not a man of action. He needed someone
Right.
to take an order and execute it.
Right.
And he didn't want any debate about it. And so he chooses McDowell. And so they're going to give a crash course in military training and march these guys into the South. So Lincoln, basically, if you do the math, he had to use these men or lose these men.
Right.
And so that's why when does this battle take place? That's why it takes place when it does. Now, let's talk about why it takes place, where it does. It's going to take place in between the two capitals.
Right. It was the shortest distance between the two capitals. I mean, the battle cry of the North was "On to Richmond,"
Mm-hmm.
right? All the newspapers had headlines said "On to Richmond." Everybody thought, well, we'll fight one engagement, we'll take Richmond, it'll be over.
You know, and in fact, that was Lincoln's pretty much his sole order to all his generals, and he will have many in the first 2 years. Take Richmond and win the war.
Right, because
And then
Richmond.
he didn't give them strategy. They did
Right.
the strategy. He gave them the order. Take Richmond in the war.
We should mention that originally the capital of the Confederacy was in the Deep South. It was in Montgomery, Alabama, and then it's moved to Richmond after Virginia joins the Confederacy.
And of course, there's been a lot of your average person doesn't really understand why that is. Why did they move the capital that close to the north,
Mm-hmm.
the northern capital? And when you look at it, it's quite a simple answer. Richmond was the South's most industrialized city.
The Tredegar Iron Works.
The Tredegar Iron Works, which made cannons
Mhm.
at one time for the United States government.
Mhm.
That is a pretty important factor to have on your side in
Mhm.
those days. And so the South knew they were going to protect that city with everything they had because the North would be coming for it. Well, they're also going to have to protect their capital with a lot of their most skilled troops. So why not combine your most industrialized city with your capital? And that's what they did. And that's why they moved. That's why they moved operations to Richmond, which will be the second of 3 capitals that the South will have in their short 4 years. So there's the why. Why does this take place where it does? The North is on the road to Richmond. The South's not going to let them get anywhere near Richmond. They stop them well short of halfway.
Mhm.
And then that's they throw up defenses on the road to Richmond. And so there's the why, when, and why, where.
Right. And so at the Battle of First Manassas, it's kind of described as a picnic for a lot of people. People come from Washington, D.C. to watch the battle. They come and set up in carriages at a quote unquote safe distance, right? And they watch the battle like it's a theater act.
Yes. Dignitaries from Washington, senators, congressmen, they're going to bring their wives. They're going to throw blankets on the ground. It's quite a spectacle because nobody wanted to miss the only battle of the war.
It's going to be the only one.
So that'll of course prove not to be the case. But this battle begins about 8 a.m. The North is actually doing quite well at the beginning. They're by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, about 6 hours of fighting, they're pushing the South back. It looks like they're going to win, but then something happens that will change the course of this battle.
And history.
There's a group of 5,000 soldiers led by a man named Thomas Jonathan Jackson. And when the battle begins that morning, they're nowhere near that battlefield.
Mhm.
They're miles and miles and miles away in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is now in West Virginia.
Mhm.
And they will get on a train
Mhm.
and they will arrive at the battlefield and be in position to fight at just the right time, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
It's the first time troops are ever moved in warfare by rail.
That is correct. In the history of the world.
Not in America, in the history of the world.
Of course, there hadn't been a major world conflict of any kinds
Right.
for a while, since the invention of the railroad anyway.
Mhm.
And so this will be the first time a group of soldiers are moved by rail line to the site of a battle and they will make the difference in the outcome of the battle.
Mhm.
And so these men line up on top of the Henry House Hill, Manassas battlefield, awaiting their orders. Their commander riding on a horse in front of the men who are kneeling and laying down. Cannons are exploding around him. Shots are buzzing by his head. He's even shot in
His hand.
one of his fingers is shot by a stray bullet. At this point, commander from South Carolina, General Bernard B., sees his men retreating off the battlefield. He rides down to them and tries to rally them by pointing to this gentleman sitting on that horse. And he says, "Look, there's Jackson standing like a stone wall. Let us determine to die here today, and we shall conquer. Rally behind the Virginians," because those 5,000 men were all from Virginia. And of course, from that point on, nobody will ever call him Thomas Jonathan Jackson ever again. He's Stonewall Jackson from that point on.
And it's at that point that the legend of Stonewall Jackson is born. And more importantly, for the event, the standing of the Virginians on Henry House Hill wins the battle.
That brigade of men will forever be called the Stonewall Brigade.
The first brigade,
yeah.
the first Virginia
Brigade, Stonewall Brigade.
And so the Battle of Manassas is what militarily we would call a rout, right? What's that mean? The Confederates, they don't just win the battle, they rout the Union Army.
The Union, they retreat all the way back to D.C. And that road back to D.C. was crowded with just horses and men just wildly running. It was such a poorly organized retreat. I mean, it was just chaos.
Right.
And of course, the South is highly criticized for not
pursuing
the men back there, but there wasn't an army bigger than the one that they had just faced waiting for them if they got there. So there's really no choice there. But yeah, the victory number one in the first major battle of the war goes to the South.
And
it's not even close.
So as battles go in the Civil War, this is the first major engagement. But if we look at casualty figures, about 3,500 casualties total in this battle. Each side had about between 25 and 35,000 men engaged in the battle. This is actually a smaller engagement compared to what we'll see later in the war.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. You look back on the Revolutionary War. I mean,
right.
George Washington never had a field army over 10,000.
So this is much larger than any Revolutionary War battle, but it's not anything close to what we'll see 1863-64.
Oh, absolutely not. It's only going to get bigger, and Napoleon will change that. This is Napoleonic warfare. So.
Right. So really quick, we spent quite a bit of time on that battle. There'll be a couple other battles that we'll spend quite a bit of time on. I want to go through a couple of these smaller engagements, but they are important.
Yes.
So the Monitor and the Merrimack, this is the first time that two ironclad ships will meet in battle. As the Merrimack is actually renamed the CSS Virginia, and by ironclad we mean that they are coated in iron. They're no longer wooden-sided ships. And they will meet in Hampton Roads in the Chesapeake Bay, the Monitor for the Union, the Merrimack, the CSS Virginia for the Confederate States, and they will trade cannon fire for hours. And they cannot defeat each other because their cannonballs just continue to bounce off of each other, right?
That's correct. The Merrimack was built first. It was an old wooden steamship with iron plates bolted on the side. The South uses a blockade runner. They rammed the Union blockades to sink the ships, and the North rushed in 100 days to complete their own ironclad ship, the Monitor, which was a ship fully made of iron.
And it had a turret.
It did.
So it actually had a rotating turret, kind of like we would think of like a tank.
It did. And these two ships, like I said, they'll meet for the only time on this one day. Months and after a couple hours of volleys, they just sail away from each other. Neither one can do damage. A couple months later, the Monitor will sink in a storm. The Merrimack, of course, when the South loses the peninsula and loses Norfolk Harbor, the South will sink the Merrimack themselves. But their only meeting is very significant because no one's ever going to build a warship out of wood ever again.
Right.
Yeah. Wooden warships are obsolete as of this day.
Right. And it's not the case that at this point wooden warships just don't exist anymore. It's the fact that after seeing this, not only in the United States, but in Europe, they're like, we're not going to be able to continue to fight battles on the sea without steel armor. Because at this point, weaponry, and this is a point that we can make, when we talk about casualty figures a little bit later on. I don't want to get too much into it now, but you'll hear historians often say weaponry and the technological advances in weaponry far outpaced tactics, right? And we'll talk about that later, but that's true even in this naval battle, that weaponry, cannons were now so efficient that if you had a wooden ship, you're going to get torn apart. The idea of a age of sail kind of, maneuver and cross the T and defeat your enemy by cutting down their mast, that's over, right? That's very Napoleonic, something that the Civil War kind of sweeps away.
Yes.
First Battle of Winchester in May of 1862. This is a big Confederate victory, and it further cements the legacy of Stonewall Jackson as a Confederate hero.
It's part of the Shenandoah Valley campaign. And Jackson's going to defeat two much larger Union armies at two different occasions. And he's actually going to start calling his men his foot cavalry. He says, my men can travel as much on foot as men on horseback. So their legend is growing.
Right. And then in the summer of 1862, Irvin McDowell has been removed from command, and the Army's been given to
George B. McClellan.
George B. McClellan, who was a guy that Lincoln did not like very much. He's called Little Mac or Little Napoleon.
Yes.
By some people. He is incredibly conscientious. He is an organizer and a planner. He wants his army to be perfect, so he drills and drills and drills. And the problem with that is,
well, within hours of the Lincoln learning of the defeat at Bull Run, McDowell is fired, replaced by McClellan, who's given these orders: train this army better, then take Richmond. Yeah. And so little did Lincoln know at that point he would spend the next 10 months training the army. And Lincoln wasn't happy about that because Lincoln wanted this thing to be over with.
Right. He famously asks him at one point, or he says, General McClellan, if you're not using the army, would you mind if I borrowed it? Right? Because he's like, look, these military commanders didn't understand that Lincoln was still a politician. He had to appease the people within his own party, who were, at this point, were very radical, and he had to appease the Northern press.
Yeah, public perception was not good for the North. And
right.
He needed wins. He needed some positive news.
Just a win.
A win. Yeah. And Lincoln had this practice of when he got really mad about something or at somebody, instead of confronting them, he would sit down at his desk and write them a nasty letter. And he would just lay it on the line in this letter and just say everything he wanted to say, get it out there. Then he would fold that letter up, open his desk drawer, and stick it in there. And he would leave it for a few days. And if he still felt that way a few days later, he would take that letter out and he would send it to that person. When Lincoln, after his death, they opened his desk drawer and they found dozens of these letters, most of them addressed to George B. McClellan.
Right. So McClellan he's finally forced by Lincoln to initiate an assault on Richmond. He says, we're not going to go the shortest way. We're not going to go over land. We're going to sail down there are three peninsulas on the coast of Virginia. He's going to go down the Potomac River and land his army near Yorktown and kind of like historic Virginia, Yorktown, Williamsburg. And then he's going to go the shortest distance from the coast to Richmond. This will become known as the Peninsular Campaign. And he has a much larger army at this point. It's about 100,000. Now, when he initiates battle, it takes him way too long to capture Yorktown. Famously at Yorktown, the Confederacy has put up what are called Quaker guns. And McClellan is convinced that he is facing an enemy much greater than himself, right? In fact, he outnumbered the Confederates probably about 3-2. But these Quaker guns is a hilarious. If it can be funny, it's funny. They whittled tree stumps into what looked like cannons, and every time he would look at the defenses of Yorktown, he would be like, "My gosh, look how many cannons they have!" when they actually captured the forts, they were made of wood, right? And they called them Quaker guns because Quakers are, they're pacifists. Yeah. So McClellan is very careful, right? And his men kind of love him for this because he's not going to waste. They feel like he's not going to waste their lives, but as a military commander, he is too cautious and he refuses to take decisive action. At the Battle of Seven Pines, which takes place just east of Richmond, it is a much larger confrontation, bigger armies, more bloodshed. It's fought to a strategic Confederate victory, as in nobody took the field. It was a strategic retreat by McClellan, but he doesn't achieve the breakthrough he wanted to get to Richmond. Most importantly, this is the battle in which Joseph E. Johnston is wounded.
Yes. By this time, Beauregard's been shipped out west by Jefferson Davis. Davis and Beauregard have kind of the same relationship that Lincoln and McClellan had. So he ships him out west to command out there. And Joseph E. Johnston is in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia, but he is wounded in this battle. He's shot in the arm. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be huge.
Right. Fatefully, as he is convalescing, as he is getting better from his wound, another Confederate general is put in charge named Robert E. Lee, and he will command the defense of Richmond, and he will command during the 7 days battles, which the 7 days battles are kind of the end of the Peninsular Campaign. And some of these battles like Gaines' Mill, and that's kind of like the ultimate battle of the 7 days battles. It opens people's eyes to how brutal the war is. It's not going to be a short war, and it's not going to be a war that either side's going to win easily.
Yeah, 7 days battle for Richmond. Of course, when Lee becomes commander there, he orders an all-out defense of the city. Mm-hmm. He calls in the Stonewall Jackson's division from the Shenandoah Valley to fortify the defenses there. And he's actually going to order his men to dig holes around the city, not really holes, but like ditches, pile the dirt up in front of them, cut trees down, and lay across the top to fight from behind. Earthworks, they're going to be called. And he will gain a nickname for this. They'll start calling Lee the King of Spades because his men always have a spade in their hand digging a hole.
Right. And he really does kind of give us a glimpse of what warfare is going to be like in 60 years, in 50 or 60 years in World War I. But he successfully defends Richmond, and he never loses his position as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia after this. After the failure of the Peninsular Campaign, McClellan retreats back to D.C. in defeat. And at this point, John Pope is put in charge of the Army of the Potomac.
Yeah, Lincoln's kind of, he's scrambling. He throws John Pope in charge. He's the third commander pretty much
in a year.
And he will almost destroy the Army in his only major engagement that he leads them in.
Not the Confederate Army.
Not the Confederate
Army.
His own army.
Right. He says, well, McDowell had the right idea. It was poor execution. Right now we have a more veteran army. They've seen battle, so we'll try Manassas again. We'll try Bull Run again. And this time it's an even bigger disaster. And actually, McDowell is there again, and he is once again blamed for the defeat, right? It's crazy that McDowell is just absolutely hated. By the end of 1862, Irvin McDowell is probably publicly one of the most hated figures of the short war to this point, because he tries Bull Run once. He convinces John Pope to try Bull Run again, and it's an even worse failure.
Yes, and Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. By now, he's promoted 3 times over the course of the first year. He's now a corps commander, which he's like almost at least second in command at this point. And they're going to divide the army up, which they would do on numerous occasions, and they're going to perform almost a perfect flank march of the Union Army at Second Manassas and almost destroying them. It's one of the classic Napoleonic tactics.
Right. It was
a flanking march.
And when we talk about Napoleonic tactics, one thing that it was against generally held knowledge. Like it was not common to divide your force, especially if you had a smaller force than the enemy. Mm-hmm. That's something Lee will do commonly. Mm-hmm. He does it here. He does it at Chancellorsville successfully. a big part of Napoleonic tactics was, like you said, that they were looking for what they called a battle of annihilation.
Mhm.
They were looking for a battle in which they could envelop the enemy and destroy their army, right? It was not just a battle where you took the field, but where you actually stopped the enemy's ability to continue fighting.
Yeah, Napoleonic warfare. This was what was taught to all States cadets at West Point, which
Mhm.
was the premier military college in the nation, still is today, in upstate New York. It's where all your major Civil War generals are trained. Lee is the most Napoleonic of all the generals in the Civil War. He's what's called the Old Army.
Mhm.
These are old tactics, and there's a simple formula involved with Napoleonic warfare: force plus mass at the weak point.
Right.
You attack force with the mass of your army at your opponent's weakest point. How good a general you are is how well you can maneuver your 100,000 men into that weak
Right.
position to attack that weak point. So
Mhm.
that's what it was all about. It's very simple when you
Right.
think about it.
And his armies were known for their ability to maneuver.
Mhm.
And whether it was in weather conditions that were not perfect or whether it was at night, they maneuvered really well, better than for most of the war, better than the Union Army. And Lee will gain, especially after some later battles, especially Chancellorsville, he will gain a reputation as, maybe the best tactician in the history of the United States.
Absolutely, and you may even say miracle worker.
Right,
Some
because
of the things he's done.
he was doing it outnumbered.
To your average person, he works miracles.
Right, he was doing it outnumbered 3-2 and sometimes 3-1.
Yes.
So after Second Manassas, Lee decides that he is going to invade the North. He's going to stage an invasion of the North, and he goes not necessarily the quickest route, but he will meet the Union Army at near a town called Sharpsburg, Antietam Creek. We call it the Battle of Antietam. Why was Lee surprised at Antietam? What happened that gave the Union a little bit of an advantage over him?
Well, he was significantly outnumbered. If you look at the amount of men he took compared to what
Mhm.
the North had up there, but Lee's battle plans were lost. He had this big map that he would spread out over a big table, and his generals would stand around it. They would mark where everything they wanted to do on the map. He would fold that map up, give it to one of his subordinates,
Mhm.
and that map fell out of the subordinate's backpack. The North was able to find that, so they pretty much knew what was going to happen and what was going to happen.
And I just have to say, if you ever get a chance to go to Antietam battlefield, it's interesting to go and see the extent of the battlefield. It's an enormous space, right? And I mean, and there are points where we have to remember they didn't have telephones, they didn't have radios, they barely used telegraph at all. Most orders were delivered by hand, right? And they didn't have like GPS, they didn't have any of that stuff that we just take for granted. There are points in this battle where Union and Confederate columns of troops will be marching so close together that they assume that they are on the same side. And then they turn and look, and they're 20 yards away from an advancing enemy column, and they turn and fire. And that's what happens in places like now famous places like the wheat field at Antietam. And of course, the sunken road at Antietam is one of the most just bloodiest points in America. Just a horrific showing there from both armies as they attack emplacements that are well defended. Antietam will be the bloodiest single day of the Civil War.
Yes, they said. Of course, failed to mention this earlier with First Manassas, First Bull Run, but the North named battles,
right?
The South named battles. The South would typically name battles based upon the nearest town to the battlefield
because it was their home.
It was their home. They knew the places there, so they would. So the Battle of Manassas, Virginia. The
Right.
Battle of Sharpsburg, Maryland.
Right.
The North tended to name battles based on the nearest physical feature of the battlefield,
Right.
whether it be a hill, a bluff, a
Creek.
creek, Bull Run Creek. Antietam Creek.
Mhm.
They said that day, September 17th, 1862, Antietam Creek ran red with blood.
Which is something, sadly, that will be repeated many times throughout the Confederacy in different places. The Battle of Antietam, 23,000 casualties in one day.
Yeah.
About a 15-hour period, 23,000 casualties. And this is something that just shocks the nation. The carnage on both sides is unbelievable. It's numbers that, if you were a European, you might have been vaguely familiar with from Napoleonic battles, but in America, we've never seen anything like this before.
And of course, Lee's, about a fourth of his army is going to be down after this battle. He's going to have to go back to Virginia.
Right. So
There's no choice. He can't advance.
They fight to a stalemate, but it is a Union victory because they hold the line against the Confederate advance on Washington, and Lee is forced to retreat. Now, after this battle, Lincoln is looking for any reason to declare a victory. And he says, we've held the line. We've pushed Lee back into Virginia. I'm going to take this opportunity and I'm going to strike a blow at the Confederacy where it's going to hurt them the most, and that is with the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah, we could probably do a whole
Right.
podcast on this document, but it's one of the most misunderstood documents in American history. It's not written with the eloquence that the Gettysburg Address is. It's not the second inaugural, but it's so important. It's a legal document, and it's written that way. It's written like a court document would be written. But Lincoln just absolutely brilliant in his wording of this. The Emancipation Proclamation will free slaves in all areas held or all areas under rebellion against the United States. Is how it's worded. As of January 1st, 1863, all slaves held in areas currently in a rebellion against the United States of America will and henceforward shall be free. A lot of people don't understand that, because when you really think about it, he's freeing slaves in places he has really no authority to free slaves. Right. Because in Alabama and Mississippi, those slave owners, they don't recognize the authority of Abraham Lincoln. Right. Those guys aren't going to free their slaves, but it's actually a brilliant move, because he knows that if he just says we're going to, all slaves are now going to be free, and with the act, we're going to free all slaves. Some of those border states that have slaves, they're going to secede from the Union, which is going to disrupt his number one goal, which is restoring the Union. Right. And so he has to be very, very careful in the wording of this. So in effect, he's going to free slaves with the capture of these places, with the Northern victory in the war. The slaves in these places that have rebelled will be henceforward and forever free. Right. And so it's a brilliantly written document by Lincoln, and it's going to change, really. It's going to, I wouldn't say change the goal of the war. It's going to add a new one on. Right. And we start to see at this point that by 1862, by this time, slaves are fleeing from Confederate lines, especially in the Tidewater around Richmond when the Peninsular Campaign happens. And famously, there are commanders like Benjamin Butler who will, ask Lincoln, what do I do with these slaves who have run away? Like, are they still slaves? Like, are they free? And so they come up with this idea that slaves that run away from the Confederate lines are called contraband of war. They are considered by the Union Army to be the same as if you found a horse that was a Confederate soldier's horse that ran away from the Confederate lines. That's now technically the property of the Union Army. Now, that was a clever way for Lincoln to word it and not, as you said, anger people who did not want the slaves to be freed in those border states, but thousands and hundreds of thousands of slaves will eventually leave the Confederate lines and be taken as contraband of war by the
the Union, and many of them will end up in Union Army uniforms by the end of the war.
That's correct.
So after his, Lee is rebuffed at Antietam. The Union is now on the offensive, but they have a new commander, a commander with possibly the greatest facial hair of all time, Ambrose Burnside. And his idea, he was I don't want to be caustic and sarcastic, but you didn't campaign in the winter during this time. We've said that over and over again during the Revolutionary War. We talked about how you don't campaign in the winter. It's difficult. It's hard on people. It's hard on animals. It's hard on your equipment. He decides that he is going to cross the Rappahannock River near the city of Fredericksburg, Virginia. In the winter, with the ice on the river, he's going to build bridges by pontoons.
Pontoon bridge.
And he is going to cross over the Rappahannock and outflank Lee and on to Richmond, right? And this is one of the more tone-deaf and unbelievable moments of the war.
Yeah, Burnside is way too cocky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you had facial hair like that, you would be cocky.
That is true. That is true. Brilliant facial hair. But Burnside thinks he's going to overwhelm Lee with just sheer numbers.
Mhm.
He does have a force upwards of 120,000 that he's bringing. In fact, the Battle of Fredericksburg will be the largest battle in terms of number of men engaged in the entire Civil War, almost 200,000 men from both sides combined. But Lee is outnumbered by 50,000 men probably at Fredericksburg. But Lee has strategically placed his army
Right.
on the heights surrounding the city, the Maury Heights. And he's basically daring Burnside, come and get me.
Mhm.
And he will foolishly do so.
And if you've ever been to Fredericksburg, which I had the ability to do last year, finally, the topography has changed a little bit, but man, you try to walk up the hill, try to just walk up the hill at the Maury Heights. It is so steep. I mean, it is brutal just trying to walk up the hill. There's a cemetery up there now. There's, of course, the Angel of the Maury Heights statue. But yeah, the Union Army successfully crosses the Rappahannock River in the middle of winter. They take light casualties trying to take the town. The Confederates retreat, and then they try to take the heights. And Lee has placed artillery on the heights, and these Union soldiers are it's basically murder. Is pretty much how it was described. There will be other battles where they'll say, it wasn't war but murder. But there were accounts of, Lee, whether he actually said this or not, this famous account that Lee looks down on the battlefield and sees just the carnage, the slaughter of the Union troops. And famously, he says,
it is well that war is so terrible. At least we may grow too fond of it.
Right. That and I think Lee still had a very sensitive awareness of the fact that he was killing Americans. And we see this after the war, how quickly he kind of is ready to accept defeat and become American again. I don't think he took a lot of, if any, enjoyment in killing Americans. I think he felt like it was something he had to do, but he did not like it. So Fredericksburg, a terrible defeat for the Union Army. Burnside is replaced by Joseph Hooker. Okay, Joseph Hooker is not the guy you want in charge of your army, right? But we're running out of people. So Lee gets rid of Burnside. He puts in charge Joseph Hooker, and Hooker decides he's also going to try to outflank Lee. And in May of 1863, he will camp his army really actually pretty close to Fredericksburg. It happens, Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Chancellorsville all within 20 miles of each other?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So this battle, the Battle of Chancellorsville, will happen basically on many of the same battlegrounds that have already been fought over earlier in the war.
Yeah, Hooker, terrible choice by Lincoln here. Of course, it is the 5th time he's replaced his commander in 23 months
Mm-hmm.
and less than 2 years. He's the 6th overall commander of the Army of the Potomac. And when he becomes commander, the first thing he says is, "May God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none." Words he would grow to regret very soon.
Yeah, so at Chancellorsville, we could talk about this for hours, but Lee divides his force again. And in a night march, Stonewall Jackson takes his left wing and he outflanks Hooker's much larger army.
Mm-hmm.
When he outflanks Hooker wheels his army about to face Jackson. When he wheels about to face Jackson, he's attacked from the rear by Lee's forces. And it is, once again, almost a battle of annihilation.
Mm-hmm.
The Union Army is routed at Chancellorsville.
Yeah, these twin victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville were Lee's greatest accomplishments as a commander, and just show his sheer brilliance as a military man.
Right.
But this battle will last for the better part of 3 days. But I want to point out that first night, the battle will last until well after dark. Mm-hmm. It's totally dark by the time Jackson and his men are behind enemy lines, and they are finally, one of Jackson's subordinates convinces him they must return to their side. It's not safe, and they begin to ride back to their side when a group of soldiers whose job is to hold the line there,
right,
see these men riding towards them. They can't tell whose side they're on, and they open fire.
Right. They were from North Carolina.
They were.
Yeah.
And they will shoot several of the men in Jackson's party, including Stonewall Jackson himself.
Right. And he's wounded in his left arm.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't die, actually. He technically dies from the wound, but he dies from pneumonia. Because at that time, medicine was at a place where, amputation was basically the remedy for all wounds to a limb, right? And it was especially because the way that bullet wounds occurred back then. Now bullets are covered in metal, in steel. Back then they were soft lead, and some bullets are still soft lead today, but back then they were huge caliber bullets with 58 caliber bullets. So an enormous amount of lead, and when they hit the human body, they would splinter apart and tumble, and they would shatter bones. And back then they didn't have the ability to fix those wounds. So the way that they saved your life was to amputate your limb. So Jackson has his left arm amputated because his bones are shattered. But because of the shock to your body that causes, he contracted pneumonia, and that's what kills him.
That's right. And he will die 10 days later. He contracts the wound on May 1st, and then May 10th, while he's trying to recover to private residence, he will succumb to pneumonia, and be a devastating blow for the Confederacy.
Right. I've been to the little farmhouse where he actually died, and it's still there. The original structure is still there. His arm is still buried there.
Yes, interesting to note. Of course, his private surgeon, Dr. McGuire, performed the amputation, and it was customary, of course, after these major battles, these field hospitals, these tents on the battlefield, men were taken there. You had to perform these amputations very quickly. Mm-hmm. They would dig holes outside these tents and just toss the limbs into these tents or into the holes, arms and legs. And so they tried to hide it from the men because it was a morale killer for the men to mm-hmm. know that not just one of their generals, their main guy had been wounded in battle. So they tried to hide it from the men, but eventually they found out. And Jackson's men will go and dig through the holes mm-hmm. with the arms and legs in there till they find his arm. Mm-hmm. And they give it a military funeral.
Yep.
And they bury it, and it has a tombstone today.
And Lee famously says after this battle,
upon completion of the battle, they're celebrating the victory, and Lee remarks, Someone says, I wish General Jackson was here to celebrate this win with us. And Lee says, yes, General Jackson has lost his left arm and I've lost my right.
Right. And he knew that if Jackson didn't recover, it was going to be a major blow. So in the East, the Eastern Theater of War in Virginia, the armies battling around the capitals of the two warring states, the Confederacy's winning. By May 1863, we can say the Confederacy is winning, definitely not losing.
How close is the Confederacy to winning this thing in the summer of 1863? Jefferson Davis is so confident, he draws up the orders of surrender and gives them to Lee. And he says, whenever you take D.C., which is inevitable, he thought at that point, whenever you take D.C., place these on the desk of Abraham Lincoln for me. That's how confident the South is.
Right. Now, things go differently in the West.
Absolutely.
And there aren't as many points to make in the West because it's a mixture of Southern Confederate bungling, right? They just didn't do a very good job of organizing in the West, and the meteoric rise of one man, really two men, but one man specifically, Ulysses S. Grant. On February 6th through the 16th, Ulysses S. Grant will capture two forts on the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, Forts Henry and Donelson, and he captures an entire army at Fort Donelson, right? This is where he gets his nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant, because when he captures Fort Donelson, and we must understand that the Western theater was mainly a river war. It was a war for the Mississippi River, and capturing these forts along the Mississippi and these other tributary rivers was how you were going to dominate the valley, right? So we're going to talk a lot more about the capture of forts and towns and things than just fighting battles. But at Fort Donelson, they're surrounded, and is it John Floyd he surrenders at Fort Donelson? I believe it's John Floyd, who previously was Secretary of War for Buchanan. He says, "What are your terms? What are the terms of surrender?" And Grant famously responds,
I will accept nothing but your complete and unconditional surrender.
Right, meaning I'm not going to give you any terms. You're just going to surrender, and whatever I do, I'm going to do, right? And the Union loves this. The men love this. And so Grant takes these two forts. He sweeps down this happens in northern Tennessee. He sweeps down to southern Tennessee, and he's actually caught a little bit off guard at what the Union will call the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing.
Mm-hmm.
We know it as the Battle of Shiloh. But he wins another victory. He wins another major victory at Shiloh, another very bloody battle. But he defeats another Confederate army. And this is really where he cements his position as a fighter.
Yeah, and again, we're kind of going back in time here. This is in April of 1862, still fairly early in the war. Shiloh, though, I think it's interesting to note that 2-day battle at Shiloh, more Americans died in those 2 days than in all previous American wars combined.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, just tremendous casualties on both sides.
Right.
Both sides.
And I think that one thing that at the Battle of Shiloh, what Grant proves to Lincoln is after the first day, all of the commanders under Grant are saying we need to pull out, we need to retreat, we need to get away in the middle of the night. And he says, no, we're gonna wake up tomorrow and we're gonna fight, we're gonna win. And Lincoln hears of this and he's like, this is our guy, because he didn't cave to the pressure of retreat. He stood and he fought. Now, the casualty numbers are enormous, but Lincoln will famously over and over and over again say, when people say, why do you stick with Grant? He's not very smart. Like other people said he was dumb. They said he drank too much, which he really didn't drink. I mean, he was portrayed as an alcoholic. He may have drank, but there's no evidence to say that he was an alcoholic at all. He was actually a pretty stern, sober person. But Lee would always say, he fights. How can I get rid of him? He fights.
Mm-hmm.
And so this Union victory at Shiloh, along with around the same time the capture of Island Number 10 at New Madrid, it has the Confederacy on their heels because the northern part of the Mississippi River is now controlled by the Union.
Yes.
As Grant will go from Shiloh to Memphis, and now the northern Mississippi Delta, I mean, the kind of the beginning of the Delta region is controlled by the Union.
Yes, and I think it's worthy to note this too. There's another major loss for the South at Shiloh. Some people consider him to be one of the top generals that the South had,
Right.
Sidney Johnston.
Right.
Albert Sidney Johnston. He is leading, major generals didn't do this.
Right.
They never should be close enough to be shot.
Mhm.
But he was leading a group of men on the battlefield when he looks down and sees his boot filling up with blood,
Mhm.
overflowing with blood. He'd been struck in the leg by a bullet, and he bleeds out on the battlefield right there. There's nothing they can do about it. He hit an artery. And
Right.
a lot of people think his death out west is one of the reasons the South struggled so much.
Right, because after Albert Sidney Johnston's death, we will have this, Braxton Bragg, Earl Van Dorn,
Pemberton.
Eventually, Lee will send Hood to Georgia to try to salvage some of the Army of Tennessee, but the leadership in the West is never what it is in the East. On April 25th, 1862, the Union captures the city of New Orleans, and this is New Orleans is the largest port city in the South. This is where most cotton leaves the South and goes to Europe.
Yeah.
So they can no longer use the port city of New Orleans.
It's always amazed me how easily the South gave up New Orleans.
Mhm.
I mean, the North took it basically without
Without a fight.
And they can do nothing now with the Mississippi.
Right. Both ends are now
Both ends
controlled.
are now controlled by the Union. So,
Right.
major wins out in the West. And I'd like to note this about when we say the West. There's two basic theaters of action: the East
Mhm.
and the West. The East is basically for Eastern Virginia,
Right.
with a little bit up into Maryland and Southern Pennsylvania. The West is not the West as we may think of.
Right.
The West,
It's really-
west of the Appalachian Mountains.
Right. Really
It's Western Tennessee,
Right.
Northern Mississippi.
Really the Mississippi River Delta.
Yes.
There is some fighting that goes on west of the Mississippi River. Famously, those will be the last Confederate soldiers to surrender under a general who has a very interesting name we'll get to later, and his descendants will have a huge role in American history. But we're really, when we say the West, we're talking about the Mississippi River Delta. The Battle of Stones River in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Murfreesboro was a transportation hub, and General Rosecrans will defeat General Braxton Bragg at the Battle of Stones River, and he will build a fort, the remnants of which you can still see today, the earthworks. And because of this defeat at Stones River, the middle of Tennessee is controlled by the Union. And this is huge because it really limits what the Confederacy can do to harass the Union and try to win victories in the West as these different parts of the Confederacy are taken away from them. Middle Tennessee was a huge, losing Middle Tennessee was a huge blow to the Confederacy. It also puts the Army of Tennessee on their heels, and it will eventually end up with what many consider to be the death blow of the Confederacy in 1864 with the fall of Atlanta, because Braxton Bragg will continue to retreat east until he gets to Chattanooga, and then he has nowhere to go from there except south into Georgia. And so the Battle of Stones River and the capture of this railroad hub and the building of Fort Rosecrans really is the beginning of the end for the Deep South, not just the Mississippi, but really the beginning of the end for a hope of defeating the Union Army of the Cumberlands in Tennessee. And they will try many times. Longstreet will even come to Tennessee later and try to retake Knoxville as a kind of a redoubt against a buffer against the Union Army, and he fails. So the Union is losing the war in the East, dominating the war in the West, whether it's land battles, whether it's taking ports on the Mississippi River, they're dominating in the West. And that will bring us to the end of episode 1. Episode 2, things will come to a climax. We'll see some turning points. We'll see the end of the war. We'll see the atrocities of total war in Georgia and the beginning of this idea of total war. And then finally, we'll discuss the loss of Abraham Lincoln at the conclusion of the war. I hope you learned a lot. I had a lot of fun with this episode, and we'll be coming right back at you with episode 7, part 2, very shortly.